In the United States and Canada, 31% of all women killed are murdered by their husbands, ex-spouses, or boyfriends. Recently, domestic violence was recognized as the #1 health threat to U.S. women, causing more injuries than automobile accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. What has been the response of our churches and synagogues to this epidemic of violence?
Too often we have been silent when we should have spoken out.
Well, I think in the past there was that sense of, all right, lady, it's your cross. And you just bear it.
And we have been inactive when we should have been reaching out, trying to identify the victims in our midst.
Once, very early, in one of the first few times, he gave me a black eye and he bloodied my nose. And after that, he realized he didn't want me to having to explain to people why I had a black eye or something like that. He always hit me where it wouldn't show.
A U.S. survey indicates that violence has occurred in 28% of all marriages. Researchers believe this figure is low, since most domestic violence incidents go unreported.
He was a Baptist, and I started going to church with him. So I became a Christian just about the same time that I married. I really wanted to start a new life, and I identified very strongly with the evangelical values that I encountered in the church. I wanted to be a good Christian wife.
Janet and her husband were college sweethearts who went on to become highly successful adults. He was a prominent community leader. She was recognized for her work as a college professor. No one in their church knew their family secret.
The first time there was physical violence, I felt like it was my fault. I felt like I just wasn't being a good enough wife and so forth. And I really thought it would never happen again.
Domestic violence or wife abuse is really a pattern of abuse. It's a pattern of behavior. It consists of physical assaults, psychological assaults, attacks against property and pets, sexual assaults.
I've just found myself tremendously isolated. He was very concerned about saving money, controlling finances, and so, in fact, he didn't even want me to do the grocery shopping.
It's a pattern of control. Controlling the person's activities, who she sees, where she goes, who she relates to, her contact with family.
And I would be walking on eggshells, trying to avoid doing anything that would upset him. And this would go on for weeks. And then finally something would trigger an explosion. And so sometimes it was just a few blows or a kick.
A subtle form of abuse, like a particular look or a particular gesture, is building on the more overt forms, which is the physical violence.
If I resisted or was angry or answered back or anything like that, then it would be a lot more. And so I learned not to do that.
One of the myths is that domestic violence is conflict run amok, that it's really about someone getting angry and losing control, when just the opposite is true, that domestic violence is an issue of power and control.
The roles that men are supposed to fill in our society are really a setup for violence. We are taught that A, we should get our way, and then B, that if we don't get our way, that we can either threaten people, push them around, or hurt them in any way that's necessary to get our way. And in fact, that if we're not willing to do that on an as-needed basis, that we're not real men.
And I had no sense of my basic human rights because I was married. Later I thought, what was I thinking? If a stranger had come up on the street and slugged me in the stomach or kicked me, I wouldn't have hesitated to call the police.
It's because we live in a society that accepts on a deep and subconscious level that women are the property of men. And when we say you may not, under any circumstances, for any excuse, beat your wife or girlfriend or any woman, we are challenging those property rights.
But as soon as I moved out and said I wanted a separation and would not come home, he immediately went to my pastor and the church board. They couldn't understand why I couldn't go back in a period of reconciliation. You know, since my former husband appeared to be so desperate to have me come home, surely I could go back for a while. How bad could it be? And that's when I began to wonder if they even heard me.
We minimize by literally just not hearing what people say. I mean, you know, we can totally shut it out and not acknowledge what we're hearing from the other person. Or we can try to explain it away. Well, it wasn't that bad. He only shoved you. He didn't mean to, I'm sure.
I just couldn't understand how these men could send me and a small child back into a home with someone who became just violently enraged. And especially now that I had provoked his anger and let the secret out.
That they not only have to fight the abuser in order to keep their sanity and to keep physically safe and to keep the sanity and safety of their children, but they also fight the community who wants to blame them and put them down.
They also said in the same letter that women should try to reconcile with their husbands, and especially that no believer should go to court against another believer. That bothered them a great deal, that there was the possibility of a divorce.
A covenant relationship like marriage presupposes, I believe, mutuality, trust, respect. It should be a place where persons feel safe and supported. And when one partner brings violence to that relationship, it destroys the trust. If you can't trust your partner not to hit you, it's very hard to trust much of anything.
It was like now I was honest. Now my spirituality could be based on what I really felt and who I really was. And I could really trust and believe in God. And I could tell other Christian women that God cares about us as human beings. We have basic human rights. We have basic human dignity. And it's wrong when anyone takes that away from us.
Not a shirt on my back, nor a penny to my name. Lord, I can't go back home this way.
Religion has always been a strong part of my life because that was how I was raised, you know, almost since day one. What attracted me to him most was the fact that he was a minister and that he seemed very strong in the faith. He was very compassionate and understanding of people's problems, but things were different when we went home. I wasn't allowed to go from one room to the other without him, you know, having a say in that. I wasn't allowed to go to the bathroom. I was not allowed to turn the TV on.
Batters are on all sorts of shapes and sizes, class backgrounds.
Pastors are abusers. Psychologists, psychiatrists, doctors, lawyers.
Well, his favorite quote that he would love to rub in my face was, "A husband is the head of the house, and you're supposed to obey me, and you're not being submissive."
When in fact, if you look at the passage in Ephesians where we find that, the verse preceding says, "Be subject to one another out of reverence for Christ." And what that means is that we begin from a place of a relationship of mutuality and equality. And within that, then there are expectations for husbands and for wives. But in no way should that be used to justify harm done to another person.
People that I loved and respected in the church made me feel like I was doing something wrong. A lot of people turned their backs on me or openly blamed me for the abuse that was going on and accused me of breaking up the family, and made me very angry because I felt that here's this, you know, tall, strong, upstanding minister. If he knocked you around a little bit, it's okay. You know, it wasn't that bad. I mean, he could always get up there and preach if he wanted to preach. That opportunity was never closed to him. and no one really said to him very clearly, what you did was wrong.
On a way
Despite her strong religious beliefs and her husband's threats to kill her and their children, Betty is now divorced. Today, she dedicates herself to her daughters and to her work for a women's shelter. The pain of her abuse is still with her.
I became very disenchanted with the church. I came to believe over a period of time that somehow I could not trust church people, and that also being a Christian meant being hypocritical. And so by remaining there, I could have pleased all the people in the church by being that good wife, but I would also be a dead wife.
When I was growing up, I have to go to church every Sunday. If we said any bad words, we were told to make sure we confess our sins. So my parents were very religious, and so that's how I grew up. My belief was that only virgins will get married in white, and because I was pregnant before I got married, and that's the reason I got married, because I was ashamed to tell my parents that I was pregnant.
The greatest sexual sin is not that it is sexual, but that it is violent, that it is dominative or exploitive. And our Catholic tradition, pastorally speaking, has not addressed that issue of violence. We haven't spoken enough about the need for safety and for relational reverence. And I think we've overemphasized the moral issue around virginity or adultery at the expense sometimes of women's dignity.
But my husband, he was very jealous of me, and I was 18. And to me, him being jealous at me was just, it gets very confusing. I thought he really loved me. I go, man, this man loves me because he's very jealous.
One of the tactics of control used by abusers is really isolating the victim from other feedback, from other contacts with other people. It starts subtly at first. I want to be with you all the time. I love you so much. Do we have to be with other people? Really wanting her to spend all the time with them. But that progresses and escalates, and he starts to have arguments at times when she's about to go out with friends or see family or even spend time with her children.
And he gave me five rules. I was never allowed to backtalk to him, never raise my hand at him. I was never allowed. He told me never to tell nobody that he hits me. He told me that I better never call the police, and I better stay in the house.
There is no divorce, and certainly that's an ideal that the Lord Jesus proposes. But it's an ideal that presupposes, strong commitment, high level of maturity, and a sense of sacrificial love. And when that is not present, then the church has always looked at the possibility of annulments.
I wanted to divorce my husband the very first time he hit me. But then that's when my mother told me that I had to go back to him, that I was married to him.
That it's not a divorce or not an annulment that ends a marriage. It's violence. That the covenant is already broken when a husband batters his wife. That the divorce or the annulment would simply bring a conclusion to that. But the covenantal bond of mutuality and shared trust is broken when violence occurs already. And that's the real sin.
And so the priest, I thought maybe he could help me. And he told me that to think about what I do wrong for him to get mad at me. And I told him I don't do anything wrong. I have the house clean. I have dinner ready for him when he gets home. I don't know what else to do, I told him. And he told me that, that to think about, to do things a lot more better, that he won't get upset. And it was about that time that it sunk in my mind. It's my fault. I got married in white. God is punishing me.
Suffering in itself and just for itself is never redemptive. And particularly is it never redemptive if it involves violence perpetrated by another person toward a spouse or anyone. But especially, I think, when the guilt issue comes in, I can understand because of the cultural and sometimes the unfortunate religious messages that women receive, that they think, quote, that they deserve suffering. But I think that's a perpetration of a male-dominated understanding of Scripture, for one thing. But even more fundamentally, God never wants someone to suffer for its own sake.
For 17 years, Delia's husband attacked his family by using his fists, a belt, a 2x4, a pair of scissors. He repeatedly raped his wife and brutalized his children, tying them to the bed for beatings, smashing the teeth of his 2-year-old son, locking them out in the winter with no shoes. In games of Russian roulette, he would point loaded guns at both his wife and children and laugh as he pulled the trigger. Delia tried not just once, but many times to escape.
And I think that we have to be very careful when we are asking that kind of question, why does she stay? That we are ignoring the reality that the abuser will not let her go, and he will go to all costs to get her back.
I had my mother, she was 60 years old, and she was going to kidney dialysis. My husband went to the hospital with a loaded gun and told my mother that if I didn't get home, he was going to start killing members of the family. And so my mother got really ill. Her high blood pressure rose really high. And she told me, you gotta go home. And he goes, he's a madman and he's gonna kill. I never went home without discussing it with my kids. I told the kids what happened, and they said, Mom, you go, if Daddy kills Grandma, it's gonna be our fault, so we gotta go home.
Despite Delia's desperate attempts to get outside help, including telephone calls to 911, a restraining order, and escape to a shelter, Delia's husband always managed to find her and resume the violence.
I have lost my faith in the church, and I had lost my faith in God, because during the times that my husband would beat me up, I would say, oh, God, help me, and my husband will respond, there is no God for you. And I believed him, because the beatings just continued. At this time, he started sexually molesting my daughter at the age of 8. And he started telling me that he can have my daughter sexually and he could rape her in front of me, and there was nothing I could do about it. There were one time, this is what really made me do it, was that he came home and he went to have oral sex, and I said no, and he beat me up. He goes, okay, if you don't do it, I'll go get her to do it. And so he went upstairs, and I actually had to get on my knees and beg him, not to touch my daughter. And that was it. I told him I will do anything he wants me to do, as long as he doesn't touch my baby.
Unable to get help for herself or her children, Delia murdered her husband. She pled guilty to her crime and was sentenced to prison. After serving several years, she was granted clemency by the governor of the state of Washington.
And I think we forget that the deeper violence is the systemic attitudes that allows for wife battering in the first place, and that this is simply a reaction violence. And in many ways, I think it really is self-defense.
But I think what we have to understand in the community, that it was not a failure of Delia's moral character. It was a failure of all of us in the community, that we could not provide her protection.
My son, right before I was taken to prison, they came and saw me, and they said, Mom, she goes, we're going to be separated, because just remember, we're not getting beat up by Daddy. It goes, we made it before, and we're going to make it again. And that's what gave me a lot of strength, too.
None of us as helpers should ever put a battered woman in the position of having to choose between safety and the support of her faith community. She needs both safety and the support of her church, and it's up to us to provide that.